So guys, I've had my R5 Mark II for about 30 days now, which has given me the opportunity to put it through its paces for both photo and video. And I've seen online that a lot of people seem to have some reservations about this camera, whether it's really worth the upgrade. So in this video, I'll talk a little bit about my experience and my opinion on this camera. And right now I'm in Santorini, Greece. I'm gonna have a little bit of a walk around, use the camera for some general snapshots, and at the same time, we'll talk about image quality. So before I upgraded to the Mark II, I used the original R5 for years. In fact, I picked it up from release, and I've always been very happy with the photo side of the camera. And when the Mark II was announced, there didn't seem to be a ton to be excited about in terms of photo image quality upgrades, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because the original R5 has fantastic image quality with sharp and clear images, thanks to that 45 megapixel sensor. And all of this carries on over into the Mark II. Don't get me wrong, I really did think and kind of hope that we'd see some tweaks to the colours though, like we did from the R6 to the R6 Mark II, but Canon kept them virtually identical here in the Mark II. But to be fair, those colours are Canon's signature warm, flattering colour rendering that, although may not be the most accurate, it does make skin tones and say sunset skies really pop. Colours are vivid and vibrant to the point where I actually find myself toning down the saturation in, say, my oranges a lot, but in general, the colours from this camera are fantastic. If you feed this sensor good light, you will be rewarded with contrasty, detail-rich images with beautiful colour rendering. And on the subject of detail, portrait or landscape photography really allow this new stacked 45 megapixel sensor to shine. The more I've used this camera for portrait photography, the more there seems to be a perceived increase in sharpness over my original R5. Images just seem to be crispier and small details are just a little bit clearer. This is mostly apparent in, say, skin detail or when you zoom in on a subject's eyes. I honestly think that it's just that the darkest blacks of an image seem a little deeper over the Mark I, giving the look of a cleaner, clearer, sharper images. But whatever is responsible for this, I'm really happy with how this camera captures and renders fine detail. And this absolutely carries on over into landscape photography too, where the Mark II will capture wide, expansive scenes in great detail. Zoom in on a small area of a large frame like here and fine details are rendered really clean and really clear. This 45 megapixel sensor is fantastic. So this makes the Mark II better than ever for heavy, clean crops in post. When capturing landscapes, this camera produces high resolution images with a beautiful natural rendering, making the Mark II by far my favorite camera right now for landscape photography. It's not just down to the resolution though, as this camera has really good photo dynamic range. I spent a lot of this trip shooting directly into an unobscured setting sun, and this camera is really forgiving in terms of exposure. Its RAW files offer a ton of latitude for recovering information in post with very little penalty for doing so. When recovering highlights or shadows, the Mark II seems to do a much better job of hanging on to colour information than the original R5 II. Highlight information is recovered really nicely, but for me, this camera definitely shines when you underexpose a half stop or so. And a really good example of its capabilities, especially when it comes to shadow recovery, is these shots I got of my wife horse riding on the beach. On this day, the sun was just brutal. It was shining directly into my lens and I had to really underexpose my subject to retain any highlights at all. And I was really sure on the day that these shots were not gonna turn out great at all. But the Mark II just recovered shadow information so well that I had the flexibility in post to pull back what I needed. And zooming in on the recovered areas shows that again, colours and details are retained really well and there's not a ton of noise or nasty artifacts either. A lot of people were concerned about an apparent reduction in photodynamic range in the Mark II compared to the original R5. And I trust that it's there and there is a difference, but in real world use, that difference is pretty much imperceivable in my opinion. And I'm just as happy with the Mark II as I always have been with the original R5. Now looking at low light photo performance is a bit of a mixed bag because up to 4000 ISO, you get actually really very clean results from the Mark II, and even when noise does show, I think it has a pretty pleasing look to it, which is really good for a 45 megapixel sensor like this. The 4000 ISO is actually really clean, again thanks to that dual base ISO, and it retains details really well, so I try to avoid going any higher than this if I can. These 8000 ISO shots show that noise is starting to creep in and details are starting to be sacrificed, but it still looks pretty good, and again, I don't really mind the look of the noise too much. At 12,800 ISO, noise becomes too much, and recovering shadows at all introduces some pretty ugly banding and digital noise. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the Mark II's low light performance in photo. It's not really any better than the original R5, and it's still beat out by, say, the R6 Mark II, which is to be expected with that smaller resolution sensor. But one undeniable area of improvement in the Mark II on the photo side of things is its autofocus. And now the R5 was already excellent, to be honest, and for a long time I didn't really think it could be beaten, but Canon have actually really made some significant improvements to subject detection. The Mark II is faster, it's more accurate and more confident than ever when it comes to eye detection and tracking moving subjects. It can also really confidently switch between subject types without having to go in the menus and change the subject priority, which is something you really had to pay attention to with the original R5. Not with the Mark II, it just figures it out reliably. And now I don't shoot any sports or wildlife, so although the super fast autofocus and burst shooting rates are nice, they aren't actually game changers for me and the way that I shoot. But there is one feature that I completely overlooked that has turned out to be one of my favorite upgrades, and that is without a doubt the eye control autofocus. I barely paid attention to this when the Mark II was announced, thinking it was just another feature mainly aimed at sports shooters, but this has actually really changed the way that I shoot. I love the eye control feature when using this camera for landscapes or just general snapshots of scenes where there is no subject in frame, where usually I would have to adjust my focus point using the joystick or doing it on the back of the LCD screen. I now can really just look at the area that I want to focus on in an image, press the AF on button, and the camera just latches onto that exact point. And I absolutely love this for travel photography. It's way quicker and less clunky than the joystick or the LCD screen. Now, onto video, and the upgrades to the video side of things is definitely what sold me on the Mark II, because Canon promised a lot, and they definitely delivered. But the most exciting thing that we're getting here with the Mark II is the inclusion of the C-Log2 color profile. And it's about time, because C-Log3 is great, but C-Log2 offers a more pleasing contrast curve and nicer colors and a much nicer highlight roll off too. And I just absolutely love the 4K image coming from the R5 Mark II. C-Log2 is so easy to grade. If you just want a quick turnaround, you can throw on, say, a gamut conversion LUT, and you get the same super sharp image that we got on the original R5, thanks to that 4K footage being downsampled from 8K when shooting in the fine mode. But now, thanks to C-Log2, it's just a little bit more organic looking and a bit less digital looking than the original R5, in my opinion. C-Log2 also gives us better dynamic range over C-Log3, which means you'll capture a flatter image, which makes it easier to capture dynamic, contrasty scenes. And in these challenging situations, you're going to get a really nice highlight roll off, and shadows recover really nicely and remain super clean. These shots are a great example where the dark interior is clean and recoverable when underexposing to retain the super bright exterior through the windows. There just seems to be a lot more latitude to play with in C-Log2. C-Log2 is also a lot easier to expose correctly in camera. With C-Log3, I would generally have to overexpose quite a bit, and even then it was a little finicky to get it just right in camera. But with the R5 Mark II, you can expose pretty much neutrally for a scene and you get great results. That 8K RAW is also incredible. It is insanely detailed, but it is also pretty difficult to edit on my M1 MacBook Pro. It's definitely a lot cleaner and more usable than the original R5, and the regular 8K is also excellent and a little bit easier on your computer in terms of editing. And it is really great for reframing in post on a 4K timeline because it is just unbelievably detailed. Now, one area of disappointment on the video side of things is that the slow motion modes haven't really had any improvements at all over the original R5. The 50p or 60p still lags behind the competition and is nowhere near as good as the 50p I get from even my R6 Mark II, or actually even the original R6 in terms of sharpness anyway. Despite that, I still think it's more than usable with or without a little bit of sharpening in post. And the R5 Mark II can shoot 8K 50, so I hope we see an option for a down-sampled 4K 50 mode in the future with, say, a firmware update. I'm afraid it's also the same story with the super slow-mo, like the 100 FPS mode. There's been no improvements there. It is a usable image, of course, but it lags behind the older C70 or the Sony A7S III in terms of image quality. It's just a bit soft and noisy. But I was actually really impressed with the low light performance of this camera when it comes to high ISO video. This camera is a bit of a low light beast, especially if you can use that second base ISO of 4000 as often as possible, where this camera remains extremely clean. And to be honest, you actually get a really usable video right up to 12,800 ISO, as long as you don't have to recover the shadows too much. You get a really usable image with great colors, whereas at this point, on the ISO range, the original R5 would fall apart a little bit and things would start to look a little bit weird. It also focuses really well in low light situations, and just like in photo mode, the autofocus improvements are very apparent on the video side too. This camera tracks subjects more accurately and confidently than any other camera I have used in video mode. You can just absolutely rely on the R5 Mark II to get the focus right a lot more than you could with the original R5. Even with, say, obstructions in front of a subject in the foreground, the Mark II tracks a subject effortlessly. IBIS also seems a little bit improved too. It is really smooth for tracking shots, especially if you're using a lens with built-in IS. Canon hasn't quite fixed the weird corner wobble though, so you can see it when shooting at 24mm or wider, like here, but it has improved a bit. Panning and tilting shots look great, and static shots are better than ever. They are very tripod-like, but still, Lumix is king. It's not quite up to Lumix levels yet. So, despite how much I've enjoyed using this camera, there are a few cons, and the main one for me right now is that it's just a little bit buggy. I've had this camera freeze up on me quite a few times, and I've also had a recurring issue where the display is just black on the LCD and the EVF, almost like the lens cap is on, and I get no image until I turn the camera off and back on again. But Canon did just release a firmware update with a bunch of bug fixes, so I'm hoping that that might have been ironed out now. Another con is that it still overheats. I've shot a couple of long form videos in 4K fine on the Mark II, and I've had it overheat on me now and again. But when I was traveling and recording shorter clips in between taking photos, for example, I haven't even had the overheating warning show up. But just be aware that if you have this camera sat on a tripod, recording for a while, then it can overheat. So final thoughts on the Mark II. This is easily the best hybrid camera Canon have released yet, in my opinion, and the best all-around camera I have ever used from any brand. But as a long-time owner of the original R5, I will concede that there's no major image quality upgrades on the photo side of things to speak of though. So outside of, say, sports or wildlife shooters who may benefit from the new autofocus upgrades or the better rolling shutter, the original R5 I think is still the way to go for photo first shooters, and the fact that this is barely an incremental upgrade on the photo side of things shows just how good the original R5 was and still is. For me, this camera excels for hybrid shooters or for those who prioritize the video side of things. I'm just so glad that we now finally have C-Log 2 in a mirrorless RF body like this, but I'm not forgetting how long it's taken us to get here, and realistically, this just brings us up to par with the competition. But regardless, the R5 Mark II has beautiful colors, excellent dynamic range, unbelievable autofocus, and great low light performance in both photo and video. And that's without even mentioning the amazing ergonomics of this thing. Canon just really know how to design a camera body for comfort and ease of use, and that's why I love using Canon. This camera has just really been a joy to use. I'm excited to pick it up and shoot, and if the original R5 is anything to go by, then hopefully in the pipeline there's a little bit more to come by the way of firmware updates in the future. But even if there isn't, the R5 Mark II is an incredible all-rounder that will satisfy any photo or video shooter for many years to come. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are you interested in the R5 Mark II? And would you or have you upgraded from the original R5? Also, if you have any questions about the camera, leave them down below. And also be sure to check out my in-depth comparison between the Mark II and the original R5. If you're interested in that, there's a link down in the description. But anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I'll see you all next time.